Well, it's finally happened. After 7 long years, the internet's punching bag Riverdale has ended. Now, I'm a little bit late on the reaction, and I apologise, but they did manage to release the finale during what was literally the busiest few weeks of the entire year for me. Probably on purpose so that I wouldn't be able to talk about it, but I don't mind being a bit late to the party. Cheryl Blossom would want me to be fashionably late. I wanted to talk about Riverdale's final season because it's truly one of the most bizarre things I have ever seen on TV. And I know that sounds rich, considering all of Riverdale is arguably the most bizarre thing that has ever been on TV, but that's not what I'm referring to here. Riverdale is ridiculous. It's pretty much its MO at this point. A show that's featured serial killer fathers, teenagers running speakeasies, Chad Michael Murray commanding an organ harvesting cult that went on to fund a production of Heathers the Musical, and then Chad Michael Murray built himself a rocket ship to blast himself into space. Oh, and then of course Cheryl becoming a discount Scarlet Witch to fight a comet through the power of lesbianism. There was a lot. There was a lot in Riverdale. But none of that is what I'm here to discuss. No, what was baffling about the final season was just how strange the writing decisions were. I truly have no idea what the writers were thinking. I've never seen a writing team so catastrophically bulldoze their own creation in the final season. Even for Riverdale, this is madness. But to understand what was so perplexing about Riverdale Season 7, we have to go back and look at how it started. Season 6 of Riverdale was definitely the craziest season of all, and personally, my favourite. All along, I thought the best thing the Riverdale writers could do was stop trying to get the audience to take the show seriously and just go balls to the wall crazy. So when season 6 started out in an alternate universe, it featured Lou Cipher, the devil himself, a magic time traveling sorcerer, a ghost train, and the entire main cast developing superpowers. I couldn't have been happier. This was what I had wanted for so long. But the one thing that remained constant amongst all of the batshittery of not just season 6, but all of Riverdale, was the characters that we knew and loved / tolerated. Season 6 ended with the residents of Riverdale awaiting the arrival of Bailey's Comet, which was destined to destroy the town. Everyone, besides Tabitha, transfers their powers to Cheryl so that she can fight the comet. Tabitha, being the time-travelling angel, has to retain her powers just in case anything goes wrong, which it does. The last episode of Season 6 reveals in its final moments that all the characters have been sent back in time to 1955, and they're all teenagers again. Well, at least the main cast, the adults. Like the parents are still adult age, but the adults that were the main characters that were adults in season 6 are teenagers again, but the adults, the parent adults, are still adults. That would be wild if they had become teenagers too. That would have been something. When season 7 opens, we discover that none of the characters remember their previous lives and believe that they were actually born and raised in the 1940s. All except Jughead, of course, who inexplicably remembers everything. In the first episode of the season, Jughead desperately tries to make his friends remember who they really are so that they can figure out how they're going to get back to the 2020s, which is exactly what I thought would happen. To me, this seems like a really fun idea. Season 6 had opened with this 5-episode mini arc that took place in an alternate universe named Riverdale, and whilst the events of those episodes didn't generally have any impact on the proper storyline, they were really fun. There was Archie getting sacrificed in some kind of ritual with Cheryl. There was La Llorona, like Blue Cipher, They were really fun episodes, and so I assumed that this would be the case with season 7. We'd spend a few episodes in the 1950s, getting to see what the show would have been like if it was an authentic adaptation of the Archie comics as opposed to a modern day take on Afterlife with Archie. Each character would slowly realise the truth, and then they would all work together to get back to the present, kind of like in the 5th episode of the Riverdale arc. Jughead had even managed to dig up a time capsule that they planted in the real timeline, despite it being 60 years in the future, suggesting there was something seriously wrong with this timeline that the characters would need to uncover. But all of those assumptions were proven to be incorrect when Tabitha, who from now on has to be referred to as Angel Tabitha for nonsense plot reasons, turns up at the end of episode 1 and tells Jughead that she had to send them all back to 1955 because Cheryl didn't manage to stop the comet and the 2023 Riverdale was destroyed. She's now trying to untangle the timeline so that she can take them all back to the future, but Jughead is making the timeline even more unstable by remembering what he shouldn't be able to remember. So she erases his memory and disappears. And that's it. From then on, none of the characters remember anything from the first 6 seasons. It's essentially a continuity reboot. Riverdale now takes place in the 1950s. It has always taken place in the 1950s, and nothing from the first 6 seasons matters anymore. The problem is that none of us realised that at the time. Before I get into what that means for the fans, however, I want to talk about what it means for the characters, because there's something I think is truly horrifying about the concept of Season 7 when you seriously consider it. Now, obviously, I know it's hard to take Riverdale seriously at all, but just go with me here. Pretend for a second that this is a normal show and that you actually care about the lives of the characters. Pretend that you can take anything in this show at face value, just for a minute. At the point that the timeline shifted, the main characters of Riverdale were in their late 20s, and they had proper adult lives. Sure, late 20s isn't old, but I'm 27, and having to relive my teenage years is my worst nightmare, and losing all of the things I've accomplished since I left school would be a real bummer for me. These characters had friends and families. They'd gone through their high school and university, got degrees, built careers, and in some cases even got married and had children. And all of that was erased in Season 7. Instead, the characters all revert to 16 years old and return to being high school juniors. Bearing in mind that the actors are all in their late 20s or 30s at this point, and not one of them looks like a high schooler. But let's take a look at what that really means for the characters. For Cheryl and Kevin, they now live in a time where being LGBT is not as widely accepted, and they both have to go through the experience of coming out as gay again, and in a place where they're not going to be accepted the way that they were in the 2020s. Betty and Veronica have lost their university degrees and the careers that they worked so tirelessly to build. But for me, worst of all is the fact that some characters have completely forgotten the existence of their own family members, including their own children. See, not everything and everyone in this timeline is exactly as we knew it in the original timeline. For example, some characters who died or left Riverdale years before the comet hit are inexplicably alive and present in this world. Midge Klump, who died in Season 2, and Evelyn Evernever, who was a villain from Season 3 and left at the end of that season. Despite the fact that neither of them ever met Tabitha, she has somehow brought them back into this new timeline. Josie McCoy also exists, but lives in LA. I don't even know how that one works. Her pussycats didn't make it though. R.I.P. Val and Melody. But while some characters managed to come back from the abyss, others were sent into it. Polly Cooper's twin children, Juniper and Dagwood, and Tony and Fang's, or Kevin, I don't know if we ever found out who the dad was there. Their son, Anthony, none of those children exist in this world. Nor does Jason Blossom, the character whose murder began the plot of the series way back in the pilot. Instead, Jason is replaced with Julian, the triplet who was absorbed in the womb in the original timeline. Because reasons. As such, this means that for the entire of Season 7, Polly, Tony, Fangs, and Kevin have no memory of their own children. Polly and Tony both gave birth. They were mothers, and they don't remember it. Now, I'm not a parent, but I know the bond that parents feel with their children is incredibly strong usually, especially if you physically gave birth to them. The fact that the writers yeeted their children out of existence is just barbaric to me. And Cheryl states in the first 6 seasons repeatedly that Jason was her best friend, her closest confidant, the person she loved most in the world until Tony came along. And now she doesn't even know that he was ever real. She has no memory of him. And of course, sure, at this point, because none of them remember that their relatives existed, they can't actually be hurt by their loss. But it's still horrific when you think about it. And it also begs the question of what happened to those characters. We do eventually see Jason in the afterlife working as the doorman of Heaven Pops for some reason, but we never see the original Juniper and Dagwood or Anthony in the Sweet Hereafter. So they didn't even die, they just got erased. They don't even get to enjoy heaven, they just got Thanos snapped out of reality? Horrifying! What the fuck, Roberto? As far as I can tell, Charles Smith doesn't exist either, so Betty and Jughead have no memory of their brother, and Alice has no memory of her only son, her first child. Although that's maybe not such a big loss considering who he was. The same goes for Veronica's older sister Hermosa, who we have no knowledge of at all in this season. She may not even exist, and as far as Veronica, Hiram, and Hermione are concerned, she doesn't. The characters have also completely forgotten their relationships with each other. Veronica moves to Riverdale in the first episode of season 7, meaning that she is starting over from scratch in her bonds with Betty, Archie, and the rest of the cast, despite having built a really strong relationship with them over the course of years in the original series. Betty has no memory of her relationship with Jughead or Archie, including the fact that Archie had proposed to her in the season 6 finale and she accepted. Jughead doesn't remember his relationship with Tabitha or that epic time-travelling date that they went on at the end of season 6. Cheryl and Tony have no memory of their relationship with each other. Fangs and Tony have no memory of the fact that they got married. And whether you liked any of those ships or not, the fact that these characters have lost those connections that they built with each other is awful. It's really, really awful, especially considering that the relationships between the characters, not just romantic, but the platonic bonds and connections that they built with each other, was kind of the entire point of the show. The lifeblood of Riverdale was the bonds between the characters, and all of those have been erased. But going back to the viewers now, season 7 has one major flaw. Well, actually it has many, but it has one fatal flaw. Because it was not made clear at the start of the season that the characters were never going to return to the present day, the viewers didn't know that they were supposed to be invested in the storylines that were given to us by season 7. I kept an eye on Tumblr posts and YouTube comments as season 7 was airing, and everybody that I saw truly believed that the series would eventually go back to the present. Many people believed that the first 10 episodes would be in the 50s and then the last 10 episodes would be in the present and would wrap up the storylines left over from the first 6 seasons. As a result, everyone was just staring at the screen through the 1950s episode, waiting for the point where the story shifted back to the present and they could begin caring again. They didn't see the point in becoming invested in these new relationships between the characters in the 50s because they would surely be abandoned once we went back to the real timeline. Sure, Veronica and Archie are having a fling, but he's going to marry Betty, so it doesn't matter. Sure, Jughead has a crush on Veronica, but the time travel date made it clear that he ends up with Tabitha, so it doesn't matter. Fangs is dating Midge, but he's married to Tony and they have a child, so that's irrelevant, although the season 6 finale pretty much confirmed that their relationship was doomed anyway. But still, the point is that no one was taking the 1950s storyline seriously because we knew the truth, even if the characters didn't. But then we reached the halfway point of the season and we were still in the 50s. And then the season wrapped filming, and all of the photos on the cast Instagram accounts showed them filming the final episode in their 1950s costumes. And then finally, towards the end of the season, an interview with Madchen Amick revealed that no, we were never going back to the present. Riverdale would end in the 1950s, and this timeline was the real end of the show. Meaning that we were supposed to be paying attention and investing in the characters' lives in the 1950s. But by the time we realised that, it was too late. None of us had been. So we were supposed to care about season 7. Oops. Well, now that we know that, maybe we should look at what riveting storylines season 7 actually gave us to care about. Oh yeah, that's right. This was the most boring season of the entire series. YouTube commenter EmilyJane123 described Riverdale's final season under one of their episode trailers as "no story, just scenes." And that is the most perfect description, in my opinion. Things certainly happen in season 7, but none of it is actually building towards anything. No one has a character arc, there's no point A and point B for the characters to start from and get to. There's this very flimsy, overarching mystery, but most of the season is just slice of life stories with no weight to them, no consequences, no stakes, no nothing. It's just things happening for the sake of happening. Here's a general overview of season 7 for you. The overarching mystery of the season revolves around a killer referred to as the Milkman. The Milkman murders Ethel Mugg's parents, as well as a writer named Brad Raybury. No, I am not kidding. And despite this murderer supposedly being this terrifying threat who kills and fades into the night without anyone ever getting a good look at him, or being able to stop him, this plot only gets brought up every 2 or 3 episodes. It's not remotely important to anyone but Jughead and Ethel, and even they seem to forget about it half the time when there's something more interesting going on, like Jughead going on dates with Veronica, or drawing comic book pictures. Like, anything at all, really. Actually, since there are only 20 episodes in this season, thank you for small mercies, why don't we just do a lightning round of what happened in each episode? And trust me, this isn't going to take as long as you might think. Episode 1, Don't Worry Darling. Other than setting up the new status quo, like the fact that Julian Blossom exists instead of Jason, and that Betty is dating a closeted Kevin, and Jughead is obviously trying to convince his friends that they're really from the year 2023, Episode 1 focuses primarily on the Emmett Till murder trial, of all things. Now, don't get me wrong, Emmett Till's murder was abhorrent, but I'm not sure that Riverdale is the vessel that I would use to discuss that, but whatever. Tony, the 1955 Tabitha, who is a different character from Angel Tabitha, bear that in mind, Clay and the other Riverdale High students of colour, such as there are in the 1950s, all return from the trial. Betty tries to write an article about it for the Blue and Gold, but Principal Featherhead won't let her. Tony reads a poem about it over the school intercom, and everyone reflects on the state of racism in the 1950s. And then the real Tabitha shows up and explains the whole time travel thing and removes Jughead's memories. Oh, and Veronica moves to Riverdale from Los Angeles. Like she did in the first episode, except from New York. Episode 2, Skip, Hop and Thump. This episode centres around the upcoming Sock Hop dance. Kevin and the Crooners will be performing, but Tony wants to convince Cheryl to allow Fangs to play instead. When Cheryl refuses, the Serpents threaten to egg the dance, so Cheryl relents and starts to build a friendship with Tony. Jughead threatens to sue Pep Comics for stealing a story that he wrote, but he ends up getting a job there instead. Betty tries to make out with Kevin, who refuses her advances and calls her a sex maniac, which she honestly is in this season. We'll get there. Veronica invites Archie over to her apartment, and he thinks it's a date, so he writes a poem for her, but when he gets there, he discovers she's invited all of the boys over for a kind of audition, almost, to be her boyfriend. It's weird and gross, and honestly makes Veronica seem way worse than she already was in the original timeline. Alice tells Kevin to pin Betty because she's worried about Betty's, deviant behaviour. Ethel gets reprimanded by the principal for drawing horror pictures, which she explains she's only doing to get a job at Pep Comics, which she then does. But then later her parents yell at her saying that she's a delinquent. Everyone then goes to the dance, Fangs gets to sing, Tony asks Cheryl to dance, but then Ethel stumbles in through the door covered in blood from head to toe because someone just murdered her parents. And that is the most exciting thing that happens in the entire season, and there's still 18 episodes left. Episode 3, Sex Education. Oh dear God. This is the first in a number of episodes in this season that focus, entirely on sex, and just feature an excessive amount of sexual scenes. Before that, Ethel tells the police that her parents were killed by the milkman, and Betty finds that kind of weird since the only milkman she knows is in his 70s. But Ethel ends up temporarily moving in with the Coopers since she has no parents anymore. But never mind all that, this episode's about shagging. Betty finds this book about human sexuality and then won't shut up about it for the rest of the season. Everyone goes to this poetry reading at the dark room, and Tony does this very cringy sexual dance, and then everyone starts having dreams about sex, which are filmed against this black backdrop and amongst these big palm fern plant things, and I watched the entire scene through my fingers. Like, I know the actors are all in their 20s and 30s, but the characters are meant to be 16, and I, a 27-year-old, do not need to be watching the sex lives of teenagers. I really don't. Like, sorry, what the fuck is going on in Roberto's head? Does he have some weird kink for watching his employees, like, all make out with each other? What is this? What is any of this? Then later, Dr. Werther's gives this very 1950s sex education lesson, and Veronica says that it's time they stop talking about sex and start doing it, which... ugh. So she throws a make-out party. Betty tries to mount Kevin, which doesn't go well because he's gay. Jughead and Veronica realise that they have a lot in common, and they kiss, and Cheryl makes out with Archie, and then the next day she tells her family that her and Archie went all the way. Episode 4, Love and Marriage. Following Cheryl's revelation in the previous episode, Penelope and Alice decide that Archie and Cheryl need to get married. They actually do plan to run away together since both of them feel tied down and restricted, Cheryl by her family and Archie by small town life. But Cheryl eventually realises that she can't keep running from her problems and tells her family the truth. Meanwhile, Ethel and Jughead are prime suspects in the Muggs murders, but they're both exonerated when it's proved that they have alibis. Betty and Kevin break up, and Betty realises that Kevin is gay when she sees him at the dark room with Clay, and Fangs and Midge find out that Midge is pregnant with their baby. Oh, and Ethel is sent to the Sisters of Quiet Mercy because she draws scary pictures. It's the 1950s, I mean. Episode 5, Tales in a Jugular Vein. This is basically just the Treehouse of Horror from The Simpsons, so nothing that happens in here is relevant at all. Just like the first 6 seasons. Yeah, it's all just spooky stories that Jughead's telling, so it's not even worth going into. Episode 6, Peep Show. Dear God! In our second sex-obsessed episode of the season, newly single Betty sets her sights on Archie. Veronica gives Betty some lingerie to wear, and Betty and Archie agree to strip for each other from their bedroom windows. It's unbearably cringe, but thankfully it's all cut short by Hal and Frank walking in on them. Tony tries out for the cheer squad to get closer to Cheryl. Evelyn starts snipping around because she suspects that Cheryl might be a bit fruity. Archie and Julian have a fist fight in the hallway, and Jughead meets his hero, Brad Raybury. Episode 7, Dirty Dancing. Alice forces Betty to join the after-school dance show American Grandstand in an attempt to curtail her deviant behaviour, but Betty flashes her underwear on national television and causes a scandal instead. Jughead is told he'll be kicked out of school if he doesn't stop writing filth for pep comics. Veronica's parents cut her off. Archie and Kevin join the basketball team. Julian tries to get Kevin to sleep with a prostitute, and Veronica buys the Babylonian Theatre with the money she doesn't have. Episode 8, Hoop Dreams. Reggie finally shows up and joins the basketball team. Tony and Tabitha start a book club for students of colour. Betty is forced to join the cheerleading team. Cheryl and Tony finally start dating, but then break up because Tony says that going steady is for squares. And Kevin gets a job at the Babylonium. Oh, and there's romantic shenanigans between, everyone, really. And then at the end, Jughead goes to Brad Raybury's apartment so that he can introduce him to Tabitha, only to find Brad dead on the floor. Episode 9, Betty and Veronica Double Digest. More sex! Betty is sent for therapy from Dr. Werther's due to her recent behaviour, and just goes on and on about how she thinks about sex all the time and has these fantasy scenes of her making out with Reggie, Archie and Veronica. I feel so bad for Lily Reinhart. She is such a talented actress, and yet she spends most of this season in her underwear making out with her castmates instead of, getting to do any actual acting worth watching. Veronica hosts a James Dean double feature at the Babylonium, but the film won't play and she thinks that her parents are sabotaging her for buying the theatre. Alice calls in a reverend to perform an exorcism on Betty after she read her diaries. Veronica tries to appease her angry audience by inventing 4D cinema, which didn't actually exist in reality until the 1980s. And then at the end, Veronica is evicted from the Pembroke and Jughead is asked to help solve Brad Raybury's murder. Episode 10, American Graffiti. The halfway point of this season, and as you'll have noticed, absolutely nothing has happened. And nothing happens in this episode either. Cheryl joins Tony's book club, Betty, Veronica, Archie and Reggie all go on a double date, Fangs becomes a local celebrity after he has his first real gig, and Jughead and Tabitha speak to Brad Raybury's wife and decide that there's no way that he killed himself. And sure enough, Jughead finds out from Raybury's neighbour that the last thing she heard on the night that Brad died was the clinking sound of milk bottles. Episode 11, Halloween 2. Veronica is disappointed to discover that Riverdale don't do Halloween, so she hosts a ghost show at the Babylonium. The ghost show involves her friends dressing up as a group of real Riverdale teenagers who died horribly, and then having them perform the floor show from the Rocky Horror Show, a musical that would not exist for another 20 years after this episode was set. Make of that what you will. Betty goes out with Archie and Reggie. Jughead brings Ethel from the convent, but when he brings her to Raybury's apartment, she finds the milkman waiting for her. And she kills him. And then Julian drives his car full of jocks into Sweetwater River. Episode 12, After the Fall. Julian is in a coma, Archie and Reggie do bro stuff, Betty is disowned by Alice, Ethel moves back in with the Coopers, Veronica, Betty, Kevin and Clay have a slumber party and sing Wash That Man Right Out of My Hair for some reason. Archie becomes the Bulldog team captain in Julian's absence. The goddamn Stonewall kids from season 4 turn up for a basketball game. Betty tells Veronica that she thinks about her in a gay way, and they almost kiss before Mary Andrews turns up at the Pembroke to find out why neither girl has a home to go to. Episode 13, The Crucible. This episode is hysterical, to be honest. So, Miss Thornton, the English teacher, is arrested on suspicion of being a communist. Clifford tells Cheryl to name all the gays at Riverdale High or he'll take the vixens off her. Hiram comes to town, and it turns out he is being investigated by the FBI as a possible communist because he's besties with Vidal Maestro. I can't even say that. It turns out he's being investigated as a possible communist because he's besties with Vidal Maestro, the Cuban revolutionary. I wish I was making this shit up, but I am not. Betty starts a newsletter, Jughead and Ethel sell comics on the black market, Archie does some acting, and Hermione announces that she's divorcing Hiram. Again. You might have noticed already that a lot of the things happening this season already happened. Veronica moving to town, Cheryl discovering and accepting her sexuality and starting a relationship with Tony, the Lodges divorcing, Veronica finding out that her dad is in cahoots with bad guys, Alice Cooper being an abusive mother, Veronica buying a local business, a pregnant teen being sent to the Sisters of Quiet Mercy, we'll get to that, Ethel being sent to the Sisters of Quiet Mercy. It's almost like we've seen all of this before and this entire season was pointless. Episode 14, Archie the Musical. Roberto Aguirre-Sacasa repurposes the Archie musical that he wrote years ago and got into trouble for, and uses it to create this episode where Kevin and Clay decide to write a musical based around the most uninteresting person in Riverdale, Archie Andrews. It's mostly singing, nothing important happens, and I can't remember a single song. The writers queerbait us into thinking that Betty and Veronica are going to get together, and then they don't. Let's move on. Episode 15, Miss Teen Riverdale. Okay, confession time. This might actually be one of my favourite episodes of the entire series. Probably because the only male character who has more than a minute of screen time is Hal. All the other guys are relegated to this one scene where they watch the broadcast at Pops. The rest of the episode focuses entirely on Betty, Veronica, Cheryl, Tony, Evelyn, Ethel, and Midge entering the Miss Teen Riverdale competition under the mentorship of Alice Cooper. The girls make a stand against Alice's refusal to accept Ethel due to her appearance. Well, all except Evelyn, but that does give us some of the most hilarious 1950s insults I have ever heard. Shannon Purser finally gets to showcase her singing ability after getting one line in the Carrie episode 5 seasons ago, and Ethel is crowned Miss Teen Riverdale. It's beautiful, and I loved it. Well, apart from the bit where Midge gets sent to the convent. Episode 16, Stag. And from an episode about girls in a beauty pageant fighting for their plus-size friend to be included, to an episode all about the teen boys in Riverdale gathering together to watch porn. Classy. Classy Riverdale, nothing but class. Veronica decides to show the Stag film at the Babylonium and everyone piles in to watch it until Betty starts screaming to stop the film because the actress starring in it is her sister, Polly. Betty reaches out to Polly and discovers that she's working as a burlesque dancer named Polly Amorous. Again, I wish I was kidding. Polly comes to town and puts on a burlesque show for all the girls, which Betty encourages Alice to attend, but of course she doesn't. The rest of the boys watch a stag film, which makes Archie and Reggie so horny that they go and have a threesome with Twyla Twist. I wish I was kidding. Bearing in mind we are now 5 episodes from the end of the series, and this is what the characters are doing. Episode 17, A Different Kind of Cat. Remember Josie, of Josie and the Pussycats fame? The character that I couldn't stand who got sent to Katie Keene, which then got cancelled after 1 season? Well, she's back! Hooray! Josie wants to show her new movie in Riverdale. She had to fund the movie herself after Hollywood tried to cast it with Lana Turner, being afraid of having a black woman as the lead. She says if it goes down well in the sticks, hopefully Hollywood will realise it can also be successful in the city. Meanwhile, Cheryl and Tony help Betty do a sexy photo shoot, and Archie has poetry lessons with Miss Grundy because the writers thought bringing back the groomer from season 1 and then giving her one-to-one lessons with Archie was a fantastic idea. But Uncle Frank thinks that poetry is for pansies and rips up Archie's poem, telling him to stop disrespecting his father's memory. Oh, and Veronica and Jughead are dating again for some reason. Episode 18, For a Better Tomorrow. The Cold War Special. Filtered in black and white, this episode sees the residents of Riverdale getting caught up in that good old commie fever. Clifford Blossom threatens to sacrifice his children to the pagan god Moloch. Yes, really. Archie considers joining the Merchant Navy, and Miss Grundy teaches the girls how to drive. This is the 3rd last episode of the show, and this is what the characters are up to. And you know why? Because there's no overarching story whatsoever, there is no path, there is no arc, there is nowhere for the characters to go, so they just do things. Anyway, the Milkman story finally gets resolved when Jughead realises that the Milkman worked for the Blossom Maple Factory. Cheryl investigates at Thornhill and discovers that all of the milkmen worked for her father, and that her mother is actually a Russian spy. Turns out the Blossoms were making a palladium bomb that they were going to send to Russia, and were using the milkmen to kill off the employees who knew too much. Cheryl and Julian have them arrested, and that's it. That's the big mystery solved. Just like that. Meanwhile, Betty finds out that Hal is Ethel's biological father. I guess this is meant to be the Charles Smith plot of the season, since, we're just rehashing old storylines. But was this true in the original timeline? And if not, why does Ethel look exactly the same in this season if half her DNA comes from a completely different father? Who knows? And we'll never find out, because at the end of the episode, Ethel moves to Hollywood, and that's the last we ever see of her. Episode 19, The Golden Age of Television. The penultimate episode. Not that you would ever be able to tell. The first half of this episode concerns itself with mostly nothingness. Betty gets her first copies of the book that she wrote called The Teenage Mystique and encourages her mum to read it. Riverdale High searches for a new principal who turns out to be Weatherby from the early seasons. Archie decides he's going to become a vagabond writer like Jack Kerouac. Cheryl takes the Vixens back from Evelyn, and Jughead convinces his bosses at Pep Comics to publish a comic with an interracial couple, even though they both know it will shut down the company. And then Jughead comes home to find Angel Tabitha standing in his train car. And that brings us to the beginning of the end. So that was season 7. A slice of life series with absolutely nothing to do with the past 6 seasons. A season where half the things that happened were rehashes of things we'd already seen in the previous seasons, but with a fun 1950s twist. A season where every conceivable pairing was experimented with for the sake of Tumblr gift sets. A season where the mystery from the end of the previous season that we thought would consume these 20 episodes isn't actually brought up until partway through the penultimate episode. And with that said, let's discuss the finale. About halfway through episode 19, Jughead returns home to find Angel Tabitha waiting for him, and she plays him a video. The video is the entirety of Riverdale in one sitting. Poor Jughead. I don't know how his brain was still functioning after that. I'm pretty sure that making someone watch all of Riverdale in one go is actually a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. But anyway, Tabitha reveals that she can't bring everyone back to the future. There's only one timeline now. This one. All of the other timelines have been destroyed. She can give everyone back their memories if they want, but they might be better off without them, considering that ultimately they can never go back to the world that they had those memories in. Despite this, everyone chooses to find out what they had forgotten, which is mostly traumatizing. Betty now remembers that her father was a murderer, that she has the serial killer gene, that her sister was killed and then came back from the dead, and that she once dated Jughead. No, really, that's exactly how that scene is written, and it is hilarious. The four greatest traumas in Betty's life. Cheryl remembers now that her father murdered her brother, her other brother, the one that she forgot existed. Veronica remembers everything that her father did, like being part of the mafia, blowing up Archie's house, and trying to destroy all of Riverdale. The only person who actually feels like he's benefited in any way from learning the truth is Archie, because he's been given a whole bunch of new, old memories of his late father. But other than that, no one's life has been particularly enriched by this discovery. And so the group convene and come to a decision. They ask Tabitha if she can make them only remember the good times. Veronica specifically words this as, forget all the serial killers and superpowers and gargoyle kings. Friendly Space Ninja said in his video, which you should absolutely watch, it's hilarious, that he felt that this was the writers deliberately asking the audience to forget all of the insane shit they wrote and only remember the good things. Which, like, could only be about 30 minutes in total of the entire show, but okay, Roberto, whatever you say. I find this so weird, though. They wrote this show the way they did for a reason. Why are they now asking the audience to forget that any of it ever happened? But I'll get to that properly later. Tabitha says that she can do this, and so everyone gathers in the Babylonium cinema to watch only the happy parts of their lives. Jughead and Betty choose to remember everything, though, realising that life is made up of good and bad and you really need both of them to live. And if you're wondering if Tony and Fangs ever express any emotions from remembering the son that no longer exists, or if Cheryl seems in any way upset about remembering the person she loved most in the world and then completely forgot about, no, they don't. None of that is addressed at all. I don't see how Tony can remember the happy times when presumably one of those would be giving birth to the son that she now doesn't have. It makes no sense. But it's Riverdale, so why would it? Tabitha tells Jughead that she can't stay. It's not really explained why or where she'll go next, it's just that she can't come back. There is a Tabitha Tate in 1955, and she's the real Tabitha now. Angel Tabitha's time in this world is up, and she has to leave. So she kisses Jughead and then disappears into the night. It's infuriating. Tabitha was truly the best character on this show, the only character that I never wanted to hit over the head with a frying pan, and that was her send-off. She just can't stay, and then just disappears. No explanation of why or where she's going, she just disappears. On a show that was constantly criticised by its own cast for not treating its characters of colour with any respect, this is not a great look. It's really not. And judging by the Instagram comments on Roberto's post about rapping Erin Westbrook, the fans didn't think so either. But that brings us to the finale, the last ever episode of Riverdale. And how did this 7-year journey of sheer insanity conclude? Oh boy. It's 2023, the present day. Betty is 86 years old, lying in her bed. She reads the newspaper, which states that Jughead Jones has died at the age of 84, even though they are the same age. So either the newspaper took 2 years to get to her, or the writers truly do not have a fucking clue what they're doing. I suspect the latter. Betty tells her granddaughter that Jughead's death means that she's the last surviving member of her old group of friends from school. She decides that she wants to see Riverdale one last time, and her granddaughter agrees that she'll take her in the morning. That night, something in the form of a teenage Jughead appears in Betty's room and says that he can take her back to one day in her life and allow her to experience it as a teenager again. And she chooses the final day of high school, which she'd missed because she had the mumps. Now, to be fair, this episode did make me cry in places, and the first was when Betty returns to being a teen and sees her mum and sister again. Because really, that must be incredibly emotional for an 86-year-old woman who hasn't seen her mother in decades, to see her sitting in the kitchen of the house that they lived in, looking young and happy, and yeah, it made me emotional. And I'm sure lots of people wish that they could go back in time and see a lost loved one just one last time. But after that, it all goes downhill. This episode is the definition of meh. Genuinely, it is so mediocre. This is not a good finale. This is just like reading a writer's tweets after their show gets cancelled and they give you a list of where they imagine the characters ended up. I'm pretty sure Dan Schneider did that for Victorious, and that's pretty much how this reads. Essentially, the bulk of this episode is Betty just walking around Riverdale, talking to people, whilst Jughead stands next to her and tells her what happened to each of them after they graduated. And every now and then we get a scene where Betty and her friends do something, but it's mostly just exposition from Jughead for the entire episode. It's slow and it's incredibly boring to watch. So this is how it goes. Betty started a feminist magazine which was really popular. She chose not to get married and she doesn't regret it. She did, however, adopt a daughter named Carla, who then went on to have a daughter of her own named Alice, who is the granddaughter we see at the start of the episode. Veronica became a movie producer in Los Angeles, won 2 Oscars, owned a movie studio, and is a huge deal in Hollywood with her hands in the concrete outside the Chinese theatre. We don't know if she ever got married, had any kids, repaired her relationship with her parents, found out if her sister Hermosa even exists in this timeline. Nothing. Just that all we know is that she became a businesswoman, which was inevitable because that's what she's always been in both timelines. Great ending, really thought-provoking. Jughead owned his own comic book that became beloved in the industry. He never married and sometimes he regrets it. That's all we hear about him. Archie became the vagabond writer that he wanted to be and travels to the US writing poetry like the 1950s Troy Bolton that he is. He eventually settled in California with a woman we find out absolutely nothing about, not even her name, had some kids and went into construction like his father. He eventually died and was buried in Riverdale. Cheryl and Tony stayed together all their lives and lived in a craftsman house. Cheryl became a renowned painter and Tony was an activist. They had a son they named Dale after Riverdale, which is actually really hilarious because the baby that they use in this scene is Vanessa Morgan's real-life son, whose name is River. River and Dale. Kevin and Clay also stayed together and moved to New York to be in the off-Broadway theatre industry, and Kevin eventually died in his sleep age 82. Clay became a professor at Columbia University and died weeks after Kevin's while sitting on a bench in Central Park feeding the pigeons. Fangs, a character who went on to get married and have a son in the original timeline, dies within 4 weeks of graduation. Him and Midge are really excited about him going on tour with a band, but the tour bus crashes and everyone is killed. There's enough money in the royalties from Fangs' music to sustain Midge and her daughter for the rest of their lives, but Fangs is dead. So this new timeline really hasn't gone well for him. He forgot his first child existed, and he never got to meet his second child because his tour bus fell off a cliff. Cool. Another great ending. Reggie became a professional basketball player, first with Kansas State and then with the Lakers. During the off-season, he worked on the family farm. After he retired, he became a basketball coach at Riverdale High. He went on to have 2 sons who run the Mantle Motor Company, and when he died, he was buried in Duck Creek next to his wife and his parents. Julian dies in the Vietnam War. Frank and Sheriff Keller were maybe possibly secretly gay all along, but they ended up getting murdered by... Check. Of all the characters to come back for the finale, check. Baby Anthony hasn't had a single mention this season, but check. Yeah, we really needed to know where he ended up. Mary Andrews once again turns out to be into women and lives the rest of her life with a lady named Brooke. Alice achieves her dream of being a flight attendant after divorcing Hal, and Polly went on to have twin babies that she named Juniper and Dagwood. But of course they are not the Juniper and Dagwood that we knew because their father does not exist in this timeline. God, this season is a fucking mess. Later in the episode, Archie reads a poem which is just making fun of all the stupid stuff that happened over the years, like Cheryl keeping Jason's dead body in the basement, Veronica being a human dialysis machine, Reggie being played by 2 different actors, and it's really funny, it is. However, it manages to break the continuity of the previous episode, where it was explicitly stated that the characters did not want to remember any of the bad things. But then here they are, discussing them. So what was the point of the entire ending of the previous episode? What was the point, Roberto? What was the... Betty and Jughead go to the cemetery to visit Pop Tate's grave and have a talk about life. Betty asks Jughead what he thinks happens after you die, which would be an emotional conversation if the characters hadn't literally gone to the afterlife in the previous season. Well, Betty didn't because she was the harlot of Babylon, but the others did. And I'm pretty sure they told her what it was like, so she should know. And the writers clearly remember this happened because Jughead references the Sweet Hereafter at the end of the episode. So... Present day Betty returns to Riverdale and says goodbye to all the places we know, like the school, the Babylonium, the dark room, etc., before eventually dying just as they pull up outside Pop's. But then we see Betty stepping out of the car, looking young once again. She walks up to Pop's, where Jason Blossom is somehow the doorman. Don't ask, I don't know. And she enters into the Pops of the Sweet Hereafter. And I just want to point out that I actually called this ending weeks before this episode airs. That's how predictable this show is. I said they were going to do the Titanic ending, and I said that Betty was going to walk into the Heaven Pops, and I was right. I was right. Betty reunites with all of her friends who are, as the spirit puts it, forever 17. And outside, the spirit who looks like Jughead but isn't Jughead, because Jughead is inside Pops with his friends, so maybe he's like the Angel Raphael from the previous season, or Jughead from Riverdale, or who even fucking knows at this point. The spirit makes a speech about how whether you come back by page or by screen, Riverdale will always be there to welcome you home, and then walks off and the credits roll. And that's it. Riverdale out. There's a lot that I could say about this episode. The way that everyone's stories are wrapped up in at most 2 sentences worth of dialogue, the way that nothing really feels final, the way that the conclusion is literally just they all went their separate ways and eventually died. And like, fine, yeah, sometimes life be like that. But it wasn't like that. It literally wasn't like that because we already did the graduation episode. We already had the characters graduate and we watched 2 seasons of them living their adult lives. It was part of the 117 episodes worth of this show that were written out of existence by the final season. We did their adult lives. We'd seen, we were enjoying watching them live adult lives, and you took that away from us, and then instead you gave us this. Instead of letting us watch them be adults, you gave us these, like, literally, like, 30-second explanations of where they went in life, instead of just giving us more of the adult life that we had. That we were doing. We were there. But you took it all away. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Why don't we talk about the real twist of the finale? I am, of course, talking about the ships. One of the real driving forces behind the popularity of Riverdale, despite how abysmal the writing is, are the ships, as in the romantic entanglements between the core 4 characters. And here's a quick recap if you aren't aware. Betty and Archie had been neighbours their entire lives. Betty had a crush on Archie, but he didn't like her back. Veronica then moved to the school, and she also had a crush on Archie, and Archie did like her back, so they got together. Betty then somehow got together with Jughead out of nowhere. During season 3, Archie and Veronica broke up and got together with Josie and Reggie, respectively, but they eventually got back together. During season 4, Betty and Archie pretended to get together whilst Jughead was faking his own death, don't ask. But this brought up real feelings, and they had an affair behind Veronica and Jughead's backs. After graduation, all 4 went their separate ways. Archie and Veronica briefly got back together, but Jughead and Betty never did, and the 2 barely shared any screen time in seasons 5 and 6 due to the actors' real-life messy breakup. Archie then got together with Betty after breaking up with Veronica, and at the end of season 6, he proposed to her and she accepted. And it was shown when Archie died, don't ask, that his heaven was him married to Betty and raising their children. But according to Tabitha, she saw an equal number of futures where Veronica and Archie were endgame as futures where Betty and Archie were endgame. Also, Jughead was confirmed to end up with Tabitha. So that's where we were prior to season 7. I liked to lurk in the comments of Roberto Aguirre Sacasa's Instagram post during the month season 7 was airing, and the majority of the replies were just people screaming their favourite ship's name. Barchie endgame, Varchie endgame, Bughead endgame. Now, personally, I hate all 3 of these pairings. I think they all suck, and I didn't want any of them to end up together. But considering each one of these pairings has existed in some form since the first season, and the coupling and uncoupling of these pairings has been the focus of the storylines ever since, really, I can understand why people are passionate about it. The writers had a challenge on their hands with these couples. No matter what way you slice it, one pairing couldn't be endgame, and at least one fanbase would be furious. If Barchie were canon, the other 2 couldn't be. If Barchie was canon, only Bughead could be canon, but Barchie couldn't. If Bughead was canon, Varchie could be canon, but Barchie couldn't. And all season, I wondered how the writers would navigate that. But I have to say, I didn't see this one coming. The way that they concluded this love dodecahedron was to reveal that Betty, Archie, Veronica, and Jughead were in a four-way polyamorous relationship for their entire senior year. They were all just shagging each other. Every combination of the core four was canon. But also not, because they all split up after graduation and none of them ended up together. Archie married someone else, Betty and Jughead explicitly never married anyone, and we aren't told anything about Veronica's romantic life or family life or anything, really. So nobody was endgame. And really, knowing that they were all shagging for their senior year isn't really any different to when they were single. There aren't any real relationships here, it's more like a bunch of friends with benefits. So there was no endgame pairing. Nobody ended up with anyone. Makes you really glad that you sat through 7 years of this lot in their relationship drama. Totally worth it. I say that. Obviously, the only pairing that I actually like in the core four is Betty and Veronica, and I think they should have ended up together. I didn't want either of them to end up with Archie or Jughead because they deserve better, so I guess I was happy, really. So that was the finale. Now let's get to the point. I watched a lot of television in my time. I was there when How I Met Your Mother threw every piece of character development in the trash at the last minute to shoehorn in a scene that they had filmed 7 years prior. I was there when The Following killed off their main antagonist and thought that they could continue the show without him. I watched Lost. But I have never seen a writing team torpedo their creation quite the way the Riverdale writers did with this final season. There are 137 episodes of Riverdale in total. But in terms of the finale, only 20 of those episodes matter. The other 117 might as well not exist. Even in the finale, the only references to the original timeline are in Archie's poem, and when Betty says that getting their memories back caused her and Veronica to remember their feelings for Archie and Jughead, leading to the polycule. Other than that, the previous 6 seasons are completely irrelevant and left unaddressed. And I think this is utterly insane. A final season of a show is usually pushing towards a grand finale, the ultimate goal that the characters have to reach, whilst tying up all of the plot threads and questions left unresolved from the previous seasons. The characters who got engaged will finally have their wedding, the character who'd been considering leaving town will finally decide what they're going to do, and the conflict that looms over the characters will finally be overcome. But not Riverdale. No, Riverdale decided that instead of concluding any plotline from the previous seasons, they would just bin the lot. And instead of a grand finale that everything was building towards, there are just 20 episodes of slice of life high school shenanigans that is ultimately concluded with the spirit Jughead explaining through dialogue to Betty where everyone went after graduation and how they eventually died. That's it. That's the season. That's not how you write a final season. It really isn't. Who reboots their entire show's canon in the final season and renders everything that came before pointless? And then has the characters in the series explicitly state that they do not want to remember the previous seasons? Who does that? There's also the fact that, collectively, the fandom had moved on from slice of life high school shenanigans 2 seasons prior. We had already done the high school years. We saw the characters deal with high school drama for 4 seasons. We saw Cheryl lead the Vixens, Betty exposing corruption in the blue and gold, Archie and Reggie getting caught up in jock politics. We had moved on. We were watching the characters lead adult lives, watching them build careers and families and lives. And then all of a sudden, we're back in high school, repeating storylines that we already watched years ago. That's not nostalgic, that's stupid. Friendly Space Ninja also pointed out in his video that if the original Riverdale timeline doesn't exist anymore, then every show connected to that timeline presumably has also been wiped from existence. So if you watched Chilling Adventures of Sabrina or Katie Keene, surprise, that was a waste of your time, because everything that happened in them has been yeeted into the ether. But for an even bigger plot twist, Roberto wrote into Pretty Little Liars' Original Sin that it took place in the same universe as Riverdale. And Original Sin is a spin-off of the original Pretty Little Liars. So Riverdale wiped Pretty Little Liars out of existence. I hope you didn't watch Pretty Little Liars and care about any of the characters, because they're all gone now. Sorry about that. And they took Ravenswood and the Perfectionist with them, so RIP. But not only is rebooting your continuity in the final season a really baffling writing decision, It's also pretty disrespectful to your fans who came along on that journey for 6 years. People who spent over 80 hours watching this dumb show only to find that nothing that they watched mattered. It feels especially cruel to the Barchi fans, in my opinion. The writers already knew when they wrote the end of season 6 that Betty and Archie would not be getting married in the next season, because they would forget their entire lives. And yet they still wrote that proposal in. Not only that, but they wrote in that whole scene in heaven where Archie imagines that his perfect life would be marrying Betty and having children. So the Barchi fans spent all of season 7 waiting for the characters to go back to the present where Betty and Archie are getting married, only to discover that that was all one big cruel joke. It was written so that they would come back for season 7, even though the writers knew that they would never follow up on it or even reference it ever again. Betty and Archie don't even talk about the fact that they got engaged. They literally never mention it again. It's one thing for a couple to call off their engagement. Fans can cope with that. People call off their marriage proposals for all sorts of reasons. But for the entire relationship to be wiped from existence and then never mentioned again, that's cruel. And I think that's my real issue with season 7. It feels cruel. Cruel to the characters whose lives are treated as playthings. Cruel to the actors who spent 6 years turning up to set and putting their heart and soul into scenes that would turn out to be pointless. But mostly, cruel to the fans who invested their time into a series that doesn't even respect them enough to allow the characters to remember that any of it happened. It just feels like a huge fuck you. Fuck you for caring about the show. Fuck you for being invested in the couples. Fuck you for wanting the storylines to actually lead somewhere. That's your problem. Roberto described season 7 as a love letter to the fans who have been there all along. But I don't see a love letter. Unless he meant the letter that Frank leaves for Bill in The Last of Us. Maybe that love letter. Ultimately, I was not invested enough in Riverdale to be particularly annoyed about the way that it ended. I didn't care who ended up with who, or if Archie chose the army or poetry. I do care about the time that I spent watching the show, but I don't think the Riverdale writers ever did. I know the Riverdale writers had gone balls to the wall crazy in season 6, and in all the previous seasons really, and that they were probably struggling to find a good way to conclude the story. But that was their problem to solve. They wrote themselves into that corner. It was their responsibility to write themselves out. I don't think the solution was decreeing the past 6 seasons as non-existent. I also know I was the only person who enjoyed season 6, but I actually would have liked to see the characters deal with the aftermath of the comet, to start building a brighter future for themselves. It could have been a kind of rebirth for their town, you know, the comet destroying the Riverdale of the past and the characters creating the Riverdale of the future. I think that would have been a more fitting ending for the series. For the characters to step back, look at the tremendous hell that they've been through and decide that the cycle stops with them. That Riverdale isn't going to be like that anymore. Maybe in the finale they would name the town something else. New Riverdale? Sweetwater Riverdale? Archidale? I get, in a way, what the writers were trying to do. The characters in season 7 got to live happily without the weight of all the shit that has happened to them sitting on their shoulders. But wouldn't it have been more satisfying for them to overcome that trauma rather than simply forget it ever happened? In real life, maybe not. I'm sure we all wish we could just zap our trauma from our brains. But for a TV show, I think that would have made more sense. Imagine if every TV show did this. Just put all the characters into an alternate timeline where everyone is alive and happy and just forget all the bad shit happened. Imagine if Supernatural did that. Their finale was messy, but god, that would have been so much worse. In the end, I don't think the Riverdale finale felt very final. Sure, we have a vague idea of what the characters did next, but it doesn't feel satisfying. Was it a fitting conclusion to season 7? Yeah, I guess, but was it a fitting conclusion to a 7-year-long TV show? No, not even close. And I guess that's what I find so baffling. Just why? Why did the writers do this? Why was this how they decided to create season 7? Why was this the path that they chose? But then really, what were the writers ever thinking? In many ways, I suppose it's the perfect finale to Riverdale. Bizarre, nonsensical, and with the depth of a petri dish. Maybe it's not so baffling after all. The one thing I will say is that Lily Reinhart absolutely kills it in this episode. When Lily Reinhart cries, I cry. She is a fantastic actor with perfect line delivery, a full range of emotions, and impeccable comedic timing when she needs it. I think part of the reason why the final episode was told through Betty's eyes is because if you want to make this terrible hodgepodge of an ending feel emotional in any way, you need Lily Reinhart to be the vessel through which you experience it. But the thing is, everybody in this cast is super talented. Genuinely. The fact that they managed to stand there and give real performances when the material they were working with was so terrible is a testament to how good they all are. And I'm so looking forward to seeing where they go next. Honestly, I wish I could take the lot of them and put them into a good show. Give them a Friends-style sitcom or a Line of Duty murder series and just watch them play characters who aren't living in the most batshit world line. Because they have talent, they have chemistry, and it's clear from the behind-the-scenes material that they absolutely adore one another. So I'm excited to see where they all go in their careers. It can only be upwards. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought about Season 7 of Riverdale. Riverdale is a series that I watched really just because it made me laugh. I wasn't invested, I don't care, I don't take it seriously. But I watched it because it was hysterically funny. Like, I'm sorry, I still, every time I think about the bit in season 6 where everyone starts coming back from the dead and Veronica's dead grandmother kicks down her apartment door and whips out a shotgun, is still one of the funniest things I've ever seen, and every time I think about it, it cracks me up. This show was a joy to behold, just from the sheer insanity. It gave me belly laughs. It honestly, it made me wake up in the middle of the night cackling to myself over the stupidest things. It was fun. That was it. That's the bottom line. Riverdale, for all its faults, was fun. It was really, really fun. And I think in a way that's kind of why this last season pissed me off so much, is because it lost everything that made it Riverdale. The insanity, the joy, the hilarious storylines, and just reduced it to this really boring collection of scenes that led to nowhere. And even for someone like me who was only watching it to laugh at it, I was disappointed. And I didn't even care. Like, I don't like most of these characters, and even I'm annoyed for them. So what does that tell you? But anyway, I am sad that Riverdale's gone. I am going to miss it, and I wish this last season had been not this. But will I still watch season 6 when I feel down? Absolutely. You can tear Percival Pickens and the Ghost Train from my cold dead fingers. But for now, yeah, I guess all I have to say is goodbye, Riverdale. You have been something. See you next time, everyone.